Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. I think somebody will be putting up my slides, so let me just let you know that there is an opportunity shortly after my presentation to break out into 4 groups to do some work together around some of these issues. So we'll move into a much more engaged mode after I've presented my slides. And I'm going to build on a lot of the conversation that we've had over the course of the last few hours. I want to put forward the premise that there is a lot of finance out there, and as the last speaker said, much of it's still sitting on the sidelines and invested in non-productive assets, sitting on treasury bonds that yield very little. And if we could mobilize that finance towards climate-related activity, we could accelerate the pace of the low-carbon transition. And we need to do it in a way that enables us to invest in low carbon and resilient infrastructure. And this, as again the previous speaker said, is a role that the multilateral development institutions have, but it can't be done by ourselves. It must be done alongside the providers of commercial finance. And I think it's really quite exciting to talk about some of those sources of finance and how we mobilize them for the benefits of our client countries and also to accelerate this low-carbon transition. I'll be talking about the barriers to climate-resilient infrastructure financing, and I want to frame this in 2 ways. So next slide, please. In terms of the source of financing and the competing demands, but also the main barriers. Now, I think it's really important to pay attention over the course of the 4 main barriers, because those are the things that you're going to be discussing in the breakout areas. Now, I'm only going to touch on a few of our ideas across all of these, and I'm sure we'll get much greater richness and diversity and views when you all get together and talk about the questions that are being proposed in the smaller groups. And if I have time, I'll just go through a couple of project examples of areas where we're actually making some quite interesting inroads into financing sustainable and resilient infrastructure. So you've all seen this slide, which talks about the demand and the enormous amount of funding that's required to fund current infrastructure, let alone the additional funding that's going to be required to make it resilience. But we're also starting to identify various sources of funding that come and that can flow towards mitigation and adaptation activities. And again, you'll see from this slide the enormous amount of money that's going into mitigation compared to the relatively small amount of money that's going into adaptation. And that's something that we really need to think about, and we need to increase the amount of money going into adaptation so that it can complement the money going into mitigation. So if I look at the next slide here, the premise here is that it's not just about the current finance that is being deployed, but it's also needs to be done in a rapidly changing environment. And we're seeing major strides being made in cities like Shanghai that have transformed themselves over the course of the last 20 years with a lot of domestically mobilized resources and with significant investment. But it also, urbanization comes as a competing priority to some of the other things that are important to us as we focus on a resilient and low carbon future, which are around conservation and how we ensure that we actually optimize land use to enable us to hit the 2-degree expectations of the Paris Agreement. And of course, the other factor that we're seeing in the climate science is that there's much greater unpredictability around how climate change will play out. And that has a particularly significant effect on the way in which we design and implement our infrastructure-related projects. We can't assume there's a straight line between where we are today and where we think we might be in the future. And we have to be much more mindful of the decisions that we're going to have to make under significant uncertainty. And we can look to some of the work that's been done on infrastructure around optionality that enables us to make smarter investments in this area. So these three paradigms are things that are really challenging the way in which we think about investing in infrastructure. And we need a framework to enable us to do that as effectively as possible. What we're proposing for this framework to enable us to think about some of these things is around the barriers that sit for climate resilient infrastructure. And the premise here is that if there is a lot of finance on the sidelines that's being deployed for non-productive usage, what can we do to attract that finance into climate resilient infrastructure? And the basic premise here is that finance is extremely mobile and very rational. It goes to the place where the risk-reward is aligned with expectations. And by looking at all sources of finance, particularly longer-term finance like pension funds, which have a very good match between the liability and the returns, and also insurance, the capitalization of insurance and insurance products and services that are able to identify and allocate and price risk and therefore reduce it effectively, we can find different ways of financing infrastructure that are going to be far more cost effective in the long term. But in order to do this, in order to make resilient infrastructure attractive to those financiers, we need to think about increasing the creditworthiness and reducing both sovereign risk and asset risk associated with those investments. So we need to create effective policies and enabling environment that can enable us to achieve that. And we need to think strategically and in a holistic and integrated way so that we can plan and program for these kind of activities. And then we need to start to think about, at the project level, what we're going to do to optimize the technical design and to think about resilience in the round, and also to enable us to deal with this extreme uncertainty that's going to come as a result of climate change. And finally, we want to link this then to the financial structuring. What is it that we, as the development finance institutions, can do to de-risk some of these investments, and how can we use credit enhancement to attract private and commercial investment, and what can we do to build the confidence of investors that first loss or other risks that are out there can actually be taken in an appropriate way by those who are best positioned to do that through potentially PPP type structures or indeed blended and co-financing arrangements. So those are the four areas we want to touch on. And again, to give you some stimulation for the conversations that you're about to have, how do we think about the policies and the enabling environments that need to be in place? And again, you know, there's a lot we could talk about here. We could make a whole day's session on this in its own right, but some of the things that I think on our mind are how do we draw ministers of finance into the conversation around climate change and resilient infrastructure? How do we link that into NDC implementation and increasing the ambition around NDCs and ensuring that NDCs both cover mitigation and adaptation? And how do we use that to incentivize investment? Some of the work that we did ahead of the previous COP suggested that there was $23 trillion worth of investments in a subset of the NDCs. So this is an enormous investment opportunity, and we should be thinking about how we use the NDCs to present that. And some of the other things that we've got, of course, many of us are working on NDCs through a lot of initiatives, and we're part of the NDC partnership, which is looking to drive greater ambition across the NDCs, and also find exemplary cases where we can learn from what's gone well in one country and apply it to other countries. And we talked a little bit about putting a price on carbon in the previous discussion, so I won't go into a lot of detail on that, but pricing sends a very important signal, and that in a world in which finance is rational, it is going to move in a way that is influenced by pricing. So how do we set those long-term signals, both in terms of putting a price on the externality of carbon and also recognizing that we're distorting markets through fossil fuel subsidies. So how do we accelerate and deepen that fossil fuel subsidy reform? And also, how do we think of this in the context of the post-2020 carbon markets? And again, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement gives us a lot of opportunity to think about that, both in terms of voluntary and stipulated approaches in 6.2 and 6.4. So how do we trade and offset some of those areas through the mitigation options that we have? And then finally, I think as we think about policies and enabling environments, it's important that we think forward, long term, towards 2050, when we really do have to decarbonize the economy. And what does that mean in terms of the development activity that we're going to undertake today? Because we can't lock ourselves into long-term carbon pathways if we're going to achieve that particular objective. The next area I think I want to talk about is around strategic planning and programming, and how do we think about multi-sectoral type approaches. We heard from Craig a little bit about the work that the pilot program for climate resilience is doing in terms of multi-sectoral approaches to resilience. How do we frame that in a way that governments can bring together all of their ministries in an approach that ensures that they think holistically about all of this? And I think some of the opportunities that underpin that kind of approach sit around climate and disaster risk screening. How do we use the tools that we've developed and ensure that they really are driving the best possible programmatic approach around resilient infrastructure and resilient investments? How do we systematically use greenhouse gas accounting and the internal shadow prices of carbon to enable us to make the right kinds of investment? And in the old adage, what gets measured gets done. So how do we really track climate finance and the climate co-benefits that come from that in a way that gives us a very good baseline of what we're doing today and what we need to do in the future, and particularly for organisations like us who've committed to really quite ambitious targets around climate co-benefits and climate finance. And I can tell you from the work that we're doing and the way that we're operating, it really is changing the way as an institution we think about doing development. So the next area is around strengthening project preparation and technical design. As we really understand better the types of investments that we're going to make, have we taken the best possible climate science and best possible data and use that to design the projects in the most effective way? And I think hydropower projects are particularly interesting in this area. It's becoming increasingly challenging to predict some of these areas. So how do we think about hydropower design in a way that enables us to build the right kind of designs for the future? I think roads, resilient roads, are another good example. I mean, what do we want to think about in terms of the size of seawalls, and do we want to invest in a 1 metre seawall today, or do we need to invest in a 3 metre seawall today, and what implications does that have for the overall financing of these types of projects? So it's really important that we think about improving the quality of project design, and again ensure that we reduce vulnerabilities systematically across all of that. And again, we have some useful tools, I think, that enable us to think about these things in terms of starting at the beginning around the investment and design of projects, and bringing the climate lens to everything we do on project design, and then taking what we've learned from that and applying it to other projects, so that we move from understanding the climate context to optimizing the design. And then the fourth area is in leveraging finance. The whole essence of physical and resilience and strengthening systems is that it makes them more investable, because you know that you're going to get a long-term return on that investment over a period of time. And for an economy, that obviously also builds in the fiscal resilience and therefore improves creditworthiness and reduces sovereign risk. So this is a really great development opportunity if we can put this in place in a systematic but practical way. Of course, we have public funds available for a lot of this activity, and they're an extremely important part of the approach, but we know that given the numbers that we've seen, that public funds are not going to be sufficient for all of the investment that we need. So we have to think about how we use those public funds to build the right policy framework, and then how we accelerate investment through using that concessional finance in the most cost-effective way, and thinking of it as a very precious resource so that we don't crowd out the private sector, but we draw it in to help de-risking a lot of these activities and investments. And that, I think, is embodied in approaches that we're making that come out of the Addis Ababa work that was done for the Sustainable Development Goals and turning the billions into trillions. And we've got to mobilize that finance in the most effective way. And if we can present these projects to private sector investors, then we will enable us to do that sort of activity. And I just want to briefly touch on one or two examples that are in the pack, and you can look at them in more detail when you pick them up. But countries like Cameroon, where we've been working with the government for over 20 years to build the institutional framework that enables private sector investment and to drive us towards a much lower carbon economy. And to date, we've seen the best part of $1 billion in private investment, complementing much of the other investment that's gone there, working alongside guarantees that take account of sovereign risk, but also in new ways of structuring these transactions. Similarly, Columbia Roads, the thing I think that's important around this is how to deepen capital markets and to use capital markets to create green bonds and sources of green investment. And in Colombia, we've seen tremendous success in investing in 32 out of 33 projects and mobilizing over $10 billion of funding, and actually deepening and strengthening financial markets at the same time using innovative bonds and financial structures. And then finally, Kenyan Water. The point I think I make here is the use of credit ratings and shadow credit ratings to create a better understanding for investors of the risks that are underlying in some of these investments so they can deploy and price their finance cost effectively. And also how you can align the governance structure to ensure that the confidence investors have in terms of the appropriateness of the regulatory framework and the ability for customers to play is in place in the right kind of way. So I think all of this links into the premise that there is finance out there. We need to build resilient infrastructure projects to enable that to finance to flow. And I want to leave you with a few thoughts around how we enable that to happen through making sure that there is country ownership in this kind of investment. The NDC is clearly an opportunity to do that. How we link this to the low carbon transitions, but also think about transformational potential. And we see that with certain technologies in, for example, here in Morocco, where the use of concessional finance and private sector finance has rapidly brought down the cost of concentrated solar power. And if any of you get a chance to go to Ouarzazate while you're here, I thoroughly recommend it. And the third area is protecting the vulnerable. We know the vulnerable and the poorest are the ones who are going to be most adversely affected by climate change. So how do we enable them to ensure that they don't get disadvantaged? What is it that we can do to build the social investment that enables the poorest and most vulnerable to be protected? The investment framework and investment environment is extremely important. We see that through the UNEP inquiry and the green finance roadmaps in individual countries. Expanding and deepening that, I think, is extremely important. And moving towards a really well thought through standardized credit enhancement approach, so we don't have to invent these projects each time, also has tremendous benefits. We can then leverage in the commercial finance, and we can blend concessional resources and private capital, and we can think about collectively how we review the incentives for crowding in private sector resources. So I think, I hope that's a little bit of food for thought for the breakout groups that we're going to undertake shortly. And I don't know quite who's moderating now, but or keeping track of time, but if we've got some time for questions, I'm very happy to take those.